the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, where the Rambam writes that the rule of Ein Beis and Yochel Levatel Divrei Beis and Chavero, unless it is greater b'chachma v'minyan, only applies to a takana or gezerah, like a rabbinic enactment. It does not apply to a drasha or an interpretation of psukim. The Rambam writes, when it comes to a drasha or an interpretation of psukim, any Sanhedrin can revisit and be cholek on an earlier Sanhedrin, even if it is not as great as that earlier Sanhedrin, because they could say that we don't agree with that drasha, we think that the better interpretation is something else. Now, l'chayra, the Rambam's statements, which is his chiddush really, there's not a clear makar in the Gemara for it, is counterintuitive, because a takana or a gezerah is only a rabbinic law. So one would assume a rabbinic law is not as severe, so if a later basin wants to repeal it, they ought to be able to repeal it. And yet, that's where we say it has to be gadol b'chachma v'minyan. By contrast, when they make a drasha, we are saying that's what the Torah means. That's a doraisa din. So how can a later Sanhedrin have the authority to say, no, we disagree? I mean, maybe they're machmir, but the Rambam seems to say even if they're mekel. So I don't know if anybody here has legal background, but in fact, this is very, very similar to lahavdil, a secular doctrine in the Supreme Court. So I'm putting on my old law professor hat. Doesn't fit that well, but and that is the following idea. Everybody knows that a court system is normally based on precedent. You look at the earlier opinions and you follow the precedent. The Supreme Court has a shita, so to speak, that precedents are less binding on constitutional interpretations than they are on non-constitutional interpretations. Meaning, let's assume that an earlier Supreme Court interpreted the U.S. Constitution a certain way. A very good example is separate but equal, right? In the 19th century case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld separate schools for blacks and white kids, and that was called separate but equal. And they said that that is not a violation of the equal protection clause of the U.S. Constitution. In 1954, in a very, very famous case, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court overruled Plessy versus, well, it's been so many years since I ever even said these words, overruled Plessy versus Ferguson and maintained that separate schools are a violation of the equal protection of the laws because they stigmatize and they connote the idea of inferiority that, we don't want to share a classroom with a black kid or whatever it is. Now, even though Plessy is a precedent, but when it comes to the matter of constitution, the Supreme Court says we have a freedom to examine a constitutional provision. Now, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education, that was many, many years. That was from 1890s to 1954. But there are times in which they reverse their precedents, even within a year or so. Initially, the Supreme Court said that the government could prosecute people for failure to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then they said that's a violation of freedom of religion. Okay, but what is, okay, I don't want to give you a whole share on this. Abortion is another example. But the idea is the following. Since the Constitution is the supreme law of the United States, then we don't pay attention to precedent because we're mechuyev to go with what we think the Constitution says. And that's going to override following some earlier court. Now, lahavdil, million havdalas. This is exactly what the Rambam is saying. When a Sanhedrin makes a rabbinic enactment, okay, that's what they did. So I'm not allowed to change that unless I'm greater in Chachma and Minyan. But when they interpret the Torah by a drasha, and a later Sanhedrin thinks that is an incorrect interpretation of the Torah, the later Sanhedrin owes a greater allegiance to the Torah than they do to an earlier Sanhedrin. So they don't have to go with an earlier Sanhedrin that they believe is incorrect, because the first allegiance is to the Torah. And if we believe, a later Sanhedrin believes, that that earlier interpretation is an incorrect interpretation, then we have to follow it the way we call it. This is the famous statement the Gemara in Bava Basra says, Ein l'dayan ela ma she'einav ro'os. A judge must follow what his eyes see. So it's an interesting thing. If they simply make a rabbinic law, we cannot repeal it unless we're greater in Chachma and Minyan. But when they interpret the Torah, we have the, when I say we, I don't mean we, I mean a Sanhedrin. A later Sanhedrin has the right to revisit and reinterpret. Yeah?
What is the distinction between an interpretation of the Torah and a rabbinic injunction? Is every rabbinic injunction such an interpretation?
Absolutely not. Many rabbinic injunctions are simply new rules. In other words, the Chachamim were misakein to light Hanukkah candles, right? They're not interpreting the Torah. They are enacting new halachos. So that we're going to be stuck with unless we're greater with Chachma and Minyan. When they're interpreting the Torah, a later Sanhedrin can revisit. Yeah.
An example would be lighting a fire. For example, when iPhones came out, the Chanan, the great rabbis of the last century, they said phones are considered like lighting a fire. So that would be an example of not interpreting the Torah, but adding the halacha?
Yeah, that would be an example, because that type of question is not making a rabbinic law, it is interpreting a malacha, right? So that would be an example where a later basin would have the independence to revisit. And you're actually correct, in matters of technology, that happens a lot, meaning even if our Gedolim may not be as great as the great rabbis of the 19th century, but when it comes to understanding electricity or whatever it is, we say, maybe we have a better understanding of technology than the earlier generations. And as a result, we can revisit. It's interesting. I had this memory for many years, and I was sure that my memory wasn't right. Sometimes you remember something as a kid, and you say, that couldn't be. I distinctly remember, like when I was a little kid, people in an Orthodox shul who would turn on electric lights on Yom Tov, and they were from. And I remembered that. But then, over the years, nobody does that. Nobody religious does that. So I figured my memory was just not right. But the truth of the matter is, my memory was right. I found out later that there were rabbis, and on Yom Tov, right, you're allowed to transfer. You're not allowed to make a new fire, but you can transfer from an existing fire. The older understanding of electricity was that when you turn on a light, you're kind of just transferring the fire from the wires onto the light. And therefore, they took the position that although you're not allowed to turn on a light bulb on Shabbos, but you're allowed to turn it on Yom Tov, because they treated it as a transfer of an existing fire. But the truth of the matter is, as you have a better understanding of it, there's no fire in the wires. It's not like there's a fire that you're moving. So that's why it's universal today that we don't turn on electric lights on Yom Tov. So that I'm talking about the old, you can't even find an incandescent, but I'm referring to the old incandescents. Yeah, the issue of modern lights is not fire at all. It's other malachas that are involved. But that would be an example that it was very, very clear that the understanding of electricity was an incomplete understanding in the 19th century, and therefore that's going to affect halacha as you go on. Yeah.
What's the difference between the Sanhedrin making a takana that you can't have chicken and milk, and like Rov Gedolim saying that you can't use your phone on Shabbos?
Yeah. Well. The difference is. I'm sorry. You can't use your phone on Shabbos. You said.
Like any electricity. No.
Well. The difference is that when they say don't have chicken and milk, they're not saying the Torah prohibits chicken and milk. They're simply making a fence around the Torah, and that's a rabbinic fence. So we cannot repeal rabbinic fences without being greater in wisdom. Masha'en Kain, when they're interpreting what the Torah prohibits, right? And other rabbis feel if you properly understand it, the Torah doesn't prohibit it. So there's, or vice versa, to be machmer as well. So at that point, we have to follow what we think the Torah says and not what the rabbis say. In that case. Now, again, I keep on saying the word we. I do have to emphasize, I don't mean we. We're referring to Sanhedrins here. We're not referring to every individual person. Okay? This is a very, very important yesod of the Rambam. I have not yet connected it to Megillas Rus, as the Brisker Rav will, but I'll connect it very shortly to how this enlightens the whole sugya. As a little aside, total digression, this is a passage in Hilchos Mamrim, which means the law of the rebellious ones, and the Rambam includes a miscellany. So I just want to point out another thing in Hilchos Mamrim that has nothing to do with our topic, but it's very relevant in modern society. The Rambam, when he addresses rebellious people, discusses the Karaites, the Karaim. Now, the Karaim were a movement, and they are a movement, within the Jewish people. Karaim literally means the Bible people, Mikra people. They do not accept the Torah Shebaal Peh. They do not accept the Gemara, the Talmud, the Medrash. They accept the Tanakh, but of course they interpret the Tanakh either in a literal way or at least not in accordance with the Mesorah. That is why they're called the Karaim. They are not the same as the Tzdukim, although the philosophy overlaps a lot. The Tzdukim lived during the Tzbaya Sheni, and after the destruction of the Second Temple, they're more or less extinct. There are no Tzdukim around today. The Karaites kind of reinvented themselves in the 7th or 8th century. So they are later, but more or less philosophically, it's very similar to the Tzdukim. And sometimes poskim, not accurately, but they'll interchange them. They'll call Karaim Tzdukim and vice versa, but they are two different groups and they're not related. Now, Karaim are still around. There's a chief rabbi and, they have websites, their technology, and it's interesting. Karaites wear tzitzis, but they don't wear tefillin because they interpret it shall be as a sign on your hand and your heart as spiritual, not physical. They celebrate Rosh Hashanah, but they don't blow shofar because surprisingly, and you may not realize this, the Torah does not explicitly say blow shofar in Rosh Hashanah. It talks about a day of truah, which we say means blowing shofar, but they say it means shouting or prayer. And truah can indeed be translated that way. So they have Rosh Hashanah without blowing of the shofar. Anyway, today, Karaites are a very, very small group of people. I mean, I wouldn't call it a major threat to halachic Judaism. But in the Rambam's time, there were tens of thousands of Karaites, especially in Mitzrayim, where the Rambam lived, in Egypt. And the Karaites, I guess you might call them the Reformed Jews of the day or whatever it is, were a real dominant segment of the Jewish population. And the Rambam actually waged a number of campaigns against Karaite innovations and the like. So he discusses the idea of the Karaites being heretics because they deny the oral law, and therefore they're apikorsim, they're heretics. And here he says the very interesting thing, that the only Karaites that were heretics were the initial generation who had been raised with the oral law and then rejected it. But the later generations of the Karaites who were raised in that philosophy are tinok shenishba. They are like a captured baby, and they are not responsible for their mistakes, and there's a mitzvah to love them and to be makarev them. Now, this is enormously important, not because of Karaites. You're not going to meet that many Karaites in your life. But this is exactly the issue that we face with non-religious Jews, that the Rambam is saying, if people were raised non-religious, so instead of saying they're apikorsim, they're kofrim, we reject them, we interact with them, we try to love them and care about them and the like. So this Rambam is a very important source for how we deal with secular Jews today. Now, that doesn't answer everybody. I mean, let's say you had an uncle who was an Orthodox rabbi who got, 5 smichas and decided to go up the derech. That may be, tinok shenishba is not an infinitely expandable category. There are going to be cases where you don't have that. Of course, then you can go into the question about emotional tinuk shenishba. Okay, that's a more complicated issue, actually. But certainly the average conservative reform Jew, the average, was never raised to understand Torah and mitzvos. And based on this Rambam, this is the Chiddush of the Rambam, we treat them with rachamim and care and concern and love. So this has nothing to do with our topic, but it's such an important yesod in Hilchos Mamrim that I think it was kedai to mention. Yeah.
So on that note, what about one of these alternative non-halakhic movements that grown adults that were born into the system chose upon themselves and through their ideology have rejected the greater Orthodox movement? What's their status?
In other words, they were raised in Orthodox and they left it? They rejected it?
Let's say they were born into these systems of reform, conservative, or whatever offshoots they had nowadays.
Well, but that's the Rambam's point. If you're born into a system and you reject the alternatives, that's not really a rejection because you were never really familiar with it. You never really grew into it. Now, the mere fact that a Reformed Jew knows about Orthodox Jews and knows what they do, I don't think that means they're consciously rejecting it. They simply have never seen its value, and they're just conditioned by the way they're raised. All right. The problem would only be somebody who was raised religiously and then rejects it. That would be a different type of issue. Yeah.
Have you ever seen or heard about Balchupas from the Kara community?
I mean, coming back to Judaism?
Yeah, now.
There must be. I can look into it. I'm not aware of any. No, again, I don't want to encourage. You're just looking into Karaitism. God forbid. But Karaites have interesting things. Because the Karaites, we always say yeshiva guys don't learn enough Tanakh, right? Famous problem. So here's the thing about the Karaites. Because they didn't have Gemara, they didn't have any of that, they actually became very, very expert, as you might expect, in Tanakh and in Diktuk. Ad kedei kach, that some of our classical mefarshim, like the Ibn Ezra and the Barbanel, will sometimes quote Karaite interpretations of biblical phrases. Now, sometimes they'll argue with them, but sometimes they'll quote them approvingly because the Karaites became very, very expert in grammar and biblical Hebrew. That was their thing. That was their limud. In fact, one of the best works about Christian, there's a whole genre of literature about combating Christian missionaries. Because what do Christian missionaries do, whether they're Messianic Jews or just Christians? They'll bring you all of these biblical verses and they'll try to prove Yashka from the biblical verses. And the truth of the matter is, I have to say that the average yeshiva guy is going to be lost. Don't get into a debate and don't assume you can win the debate. When they start throwing out Isaiah 53 and Daniel 12, because we learned Daniel, but whatever it would be, all of these different things, most people have never heard of them at all. But one of the best anti-missionary books is called Chizuk Emunah, The Strengthening of Faith, written by Rav Yitzchak Traki, I shouldn't say Rabbi, Yitzchak Traki, who was a Karaite. And why would a Karaite book be the best work? Because here's the problem. If you're coming from the Torah world, so you'll refute Christian claims by citing Gemaros, Medrash, Rambam. Well, the Christian will just say, I don't accept Gemara, Medrash, Rambam. You can't refute me by citing all of these sources that I don't regard as authoritative. I mean, what am I going to say to a Christian? You can't say that because you're contradicting Tosos and Bava Kama. Says, all right, so. Now, the thing about the Karaite is he doesn't bring in the Gemara, Taisus, or Rambam. He shows the implausibility of the Christian claim by the actual words of the Bible itself. So that makes it a very powerful argument because he's using the very sources that the Christians are relying upon to make their case. And he's showing that it's incorrect. So it's a bit of a paradox that maybe the best book on refuting Christian claims based on Tanakh was written by a Karaite precisely because the Karaite is not relying on rabbinic sources. The Karaite is using the very sources the Christian is using to show that the argument is invalid. Yeah.
Are all the interpretations in interpretations that we would agree with, or some of them against?
Yeah. So here's the thing. So Baruch Hashem. Obviously, that's a very important question that you'd have to examine. But as far as I can't say I'm a complete expert in the book, but as far as I can tell, his interpretations do not contradict. On those verses, do not contradict our interpretation. So, although a lot of what a Karaite would say we could not be makabel at all, but in this particular area, it's legitimate. Yeah.
Would we consider modern day Karaite eligible for Hiruv? Like, are these halachic Jews?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Are the Karaites halachic Jews? So we did have a psak. The Rambam, when there were tens of thousands of Karaites in Mitzrayim, and even later, in Ovadia Yosef's time, which was maybe 80 years ago, he had paskined that they are Jews. They had that they're Jews who are wayward Jews. But I would have to say that any individual case would have to be determined individually, because in the course of time, obviously there might be all sorts of people who are hangers-on to Karaites, and who knows where they came from, and if they underwent a conversion, it wouldn't be a halachic conversion. So you do have to check. You can't automatically assume that they're Jewish. Yeah.
Is the chief rabbi of the Karaites like a chacham, or is he just kind of a guy that knows how to
Well, it depends what you mean, chacham. I mean, he knows what a Karaite rabbi is supposed to know. I mean, he's knowledgeable. Now, the truth of the matter is, it's not like. It's not like a Karaite rabbi wouldn't learn Gemara. He would learn Gemara. He just doesn't regard it as authoritative. So the same way that an Orthodox rabbi might learn aspects of Christianity, so a Karaite rabbi also knows, some Gemara. But once again, I mean, I wouldn't call them Talmid Chacham in Gemara, simply because, for them it's a waste of time. Yeah.
Even in Tanakh, are they even close to the level of the author of the Emunah?
Probably not, but once again, I mean, there's Niskatnu Hadoros even with Karaites too. Some of them are not as learned as the old Karaites were. Yeah.
At what point is there an obligation to investigate? So nowadays, that there's other sections, that there's Orthodox Judaism. At what point do they have an obligation to explore that? And to see
So-
the truth in it?
Rav Elyashiv took a very, very strict view, which to me is very difficult. Rav Elyashiv basically said there is no Tinok Shenishba today because everybody knows about Orthodox Jews and everybody knows they keep Shabbos and kosher. So the notion that I didn't know just isn't true. But most poskim do not agree with that, because most poskim say, well, listen, if I know there are Orthodox Jews, but I think they're crazy, I know there are Shomer Shabbos Jews, but I think, they're behaving, like crazy people. So it's not really knowing. So you can't automatically assume a person has an obligation to check out things that they think are irrational. Now, if you are makar of them, you expose them to things, then at some point there may be more of an obligation on them to go further. So in effect, when you reach out to them, you're putting them in a more difficult situation, but ultimately that could also turn out to be a better situation, depending on what you do. Yeah.
Is there a halachic implication for Tinok Shenishba in the area of Lashon Hara?
In terms of Lashon Hara, I think there would be, yes. That's very, very true, because if a Tinok Shenishba is not considered a Rasha or an Apikoris, you should not say Lashon Hara about them, unless you have other heterim, such as, so people shouldn't learn from their ways, because even a Tinok Shenishba, we shouldn't learn from their ways. So you'd have to locate heterim, but the overall rule for Rishayim and the like would not apply to Tinok Shenishba. Yeah.
I just have one question on this. Did Rambam post him that you could marry a Karaite, and so long as they were to eventually want to come back to Orthodox Judaism?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Rambam's shita, but again, as I say, you have to investigate every individual case today. But the Rambam shita is, and Rav Yosef said it hundreds of years later, that Karaites are halachic Jews. And if they are halachic Jews, then marrying a Karaite is like marrying a non-religious Jew, which we wouldn't advise unless they're in the process of doing of doing tshuva. But they are Jewish. In other words, they don't need conversion, according to this. That's what the Rambam says. Yeah.
Would it be possible for someone who was raised with like Shabbos and Kashrus, but if you were to examine the chinuch, the theologian, is it possible to still fall in the category of chinuch?
Yes, although I don't know if Tinok Shenishba would be the right terminology, but there is a concept that sometimes the way a person is raised, even if technically it was religious, may have been so destructive and so negative that they're not fully responsible for their rebellion because they were placed in a type of abusive type of environment. So that's a different nakuda than the Rambam is saying, but there may be similar ideas. So as a result, kids who go off the derech, even though they're not tinok shenishba, but they may fall under that for emotional reasons, which can be very powerful. I mean, sometimes, what can I tell you? Sometimes the Jewish system or the parenting even can be very, very cruel and very, very destructive. And a kid who rebels is not fully responsible for that, and we try to bring him back with love and support. Okay, alrighty. So now, this is digression on digression on digression, but okay, let's go back to what the Brisker Rav says. If we go back to the Rambam, and we have the chiluk between drasha and a drabanan, so let's now examine the makor of the rule. Right, the whole book of Rus, halachically, is establishing the proposition that you're allowed to marry female Moabites. Now, how do we know that? How do we know, or how did Boaz know that you're allowed to marry female Moabite? So there is a drasha that is made, an interpretation, because the Torah says in Parshas Kiseitze, Lo Yavo Ammoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem, an Ammonite or a Moabite should not enter the congregation of God, meaning they don't marry, even if they convert. And it gives a reason. Al devar asher lo kidmu eschem b'lechem u'v'mayim, because they did not offer you food and water when you needed to pass through on the way to Eretz Yisrael. That's the reason the Torah gives. Like kidmu etchem b'lechem u'v'mayim. You can ask a very good kasha on that reason. Why did we need food and water? We were still getting man. Okay, that's a good question. But putting that question aside, this is what the Gemara darshans. Darkai shel ish l'kadem. It is the way of a man to bring food and water to an invading group, to an outside group. Ein darka shel isha. You can't expect women to go out to an invading nation and offer them food and water, because that's not a modest sanua type of thing. So the reason females are permitted, it seems, is because we have an interpretation. Like kidmu eschem b'lechem u'v'mayim, darka shelish l'kadem, ein darka shelisha l'kadem. This is a drasha. So now, says the Brisker Rav, Ploni Almoni is now going to be seen in a totally new light. Ploni Almoni refuses to marry Rus because Rashi says he's making a mistake regarding the heter of Moabite women. So most understand Rashi to mean that he has the position that it's forbidden. And then we ask the kasha, if it's forbidden, why is he concerned only with his children? Right, that's our question. Here's what the Brisker Rav says. He's not mistaken about the halacha. He knows it's permitted. But he thinks it's only permitted because of this drasha. So what's wrong with that? So this is what he says. I can go ahead and marry her because I am relying on the drasha that this Sanhedrin makes. So I'm okay. But what's going to be if 100 years from now, a later Sanhedrin is going to revisit and think it's erroneous? And they're going to say even the females are forbidden. That's not going to affect me in Olam Haba, because at the time I acted in accordance with that interpretation. But lemafreya, it does mean this was a prohibited union, so my children are going to be tainted. Right? So this is a much more sophisticated mistake. The mistake was, it's not a drasha, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that can never be changed. That's the mistake. Now, the truth of the matter is, Ploni Almoni's fear is exactly correct. The Gemara in Yevamais records that years later, when Shaul was king, and David killed Goliath, David killed Goliath. So Shaul was so curious, who is this kid? I mean, he was in his 20s, but who is this kid that could kill this ferocious giant? I mean, he's like a kingly figure. So Doeg Koadomi, who always spoke Lashon Hara, said, he's a Moabite. He can't even marry into the Jewish people. The Torah says Moabites can't marry into the Jewish people. He comes from Rus. And other rabbis said, no. He comes from a female Moabite, so it's mutter. And Doeg says, well, why is it mutter? So they said, because it says that they didn't give food and water, and it's only the men that don't give food and water and not the women. And Doeg said, what do you mean? The men should have brought it to the men, and the women should have brought it to the women. In other words, Doeg is arguing the drasha is incorrect, and David is puzzled. Exactly as Ploni Almoni was saying. And the Gemara ends that somebody girded himself with a sword, and he said, I have an unbroken Masorah from Shmuel Hanavi, who received it all the way back from Moshe Rabbeinu, that females are permitted, meaning it's not a drasha, it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Right? It's a beautiful Brisker Rav. So the Brisker Rav says, so Ploni Almoni is becoming more and more learned as we go on. He's an Amoritz, and Rashi says he's making a mistake in the law of Moabite. But look at how sophisticated the mistake is. It's not like we learned he thinks it's forbidden. He knows it's permitted, but he thinks it's a drasha. And he's afraid that years later, as was indeed the case, someone will claim the drasha is incorrect. And the Rambam says in Hilchos Mamrim that even a lesser Beis Din can repeal a drasha. His mistake was it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which obviously cannot be changed. It's a direct, unbroken tradition. Right, so this is how the Brisker Rav learns why Ploni Almoni is only concerned for his children. He is not concerned for himself. Okay? Alrighty, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.